What was trench warfare like in World War One? By 1915, World War One on the Western Front in Europe slowed to a defensive deadlock as opposing armies dug themselves into the ground. Let's jump into a quick overview of what trench warfare was like in World War One. World War One is well remembered for trench warfare and is often depicted in films such as Gallipoli by Peter Weir, with Mel Gibson here, in the recent 1917 by Sam Mendes, where two young soldiers storm across no man's land. Paths of Glory with Kirk Douglas here, walking the trenches, ducking fire. And the documentary They Shall Not Grow Old by Peter Jackson, which uses and restores archival footage from black and white into colour. So in the beginning of World War I, German forces invaded Belgian neutrality. This brought Britain into the war. And the Schlieffen Plan of Germany, their swinging gate, dictated that they would go around the French forts around Verdun and the line here, in a kind of an arcing fashion. They'd go around the forts, bypass their French defences on their way to Paris. So as the Germans advanced into France, an important Allied turning point would be the Battle of the Marne in September 1914 along the Marne River. So the German forces were forced to retreat backwards after this battle and try and hold their ground, and they started to dig in. So then this meant that the two armies then attempted to outflank each other up towards the north. So they both worked their way north, and these maneuvers to try and maneuver around each other was known as the race to the sea. So this was a series of stalemated collisions back and forth along the successive rungs of a ladder, the rungs following vital parallel railways, which were an important form of transport infrastructure during World War One. So eventually both sides became stuck in place and dug trenches to fortify and hold their positions. So from the Swiss border along to the Belgian coast, a line 750 kilometers long, troops had dug in and deadlock prevailed. And this declined into a stalemate and a war of attrition, wearing each other down. French commander we see here, General Philippe Pétain, argued that there will be no decisive battle, as in other times. Success will come eventually to the side that has the last man. The only objective we should seek is to kill as many Germans as we can, while suffering a minimum of losses. So digging a trench provided soldiers cover from enemy fire and artillery shells, and led to this form of stalemate. So weapons and tactics were much more effective in defense and made it very difficult to attack or gain ground. Heavy artillery became more important in a less mobile war. Weeks, months, and horrible casualties went by to fight tooth and nail over destroyed fields covered in shell holes, like you can see here. So Verdun here became to look like the moon, full of craters from shell holes. Some of the other major battlefields in World War I at the time in the trenches were the Somme, the Argonne Forest, Flanders, and Ypres in France. Again, you can see Verdun here. So you can also see that the trench lines would be shaped in a zigzag of what were called traverses to diffuse blasts and prevent an attacker from jumping in the trench with you and commanding a straight firing line down the trench. In between the two lines was no man's land and barbed wire, which you can see a little bit of here, which was an important new recent invention from cattle ranchers in the US, was preventing troops from launching attacks because you had to get through the barbed wire to get towards the enemy trenches. So leaving the trench over the top also meant that you were vulnerable to enemy machine guns and sniper fire. So by the end of 1915, the Germans had built very impressive trenches, and they had built second and third lines behind the front lines. So further back from the action would also be communication trenches, support and supply lines, reinforcements, and munitions. You can see a really good diagram there. You might hit pause on. So living conditions in the trenches were terrible. The smell, decay, death, rationed food, rats eating your bread, burning lice from your clothes or scraping them off your skin with a knife, the danger each day, the shell shock, mud, sickness and disease, lack of sleep, continuous attacks by the enemy, the deaths of friends, gas attacks, trench foot, having to go over the top to attack and charge enemy trenches across no man's land in what often seem like hopeless attacks. And we can see some of the weapons used here, showing how close quarters this combat was, getting right up in the face of the enemy and throwing a grenade there. So in the book, Tommy Goes to War, a British captain here talks about the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Got a quote here. The trench was a horrible sight. The dead were stretched out on one side, one on top of each other, 6 feet high. I thought at the time I should never get the peculiar, disgusting smell of the vapor of warm human blood heated by the sun out of my nostrils. So it's pretty disgusting, but it's one of the kind of even less disgusting quotes that I've read through to give you an example of what this was like. I would rather have smelt gas 100 times, quotes the soldier. I can never describe that faint, sickening, horrible smell which several times nearly knocked me up altogether. So from that British captain. Here are a few resources that I recommend and that I used in producing this. All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque, The Ring of Steel by Alexander Watson, The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman, and First World War by John Keegan, famous historian. These are 4 books, as well as Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, the series called Blueprint for Armageddon, which is very long and detailed, the documentary I mentioned by Peter Jackson, and the Great Wars YouTube channel. Thank you for listening.